Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday morning at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30, but we also have some other times now on Saturday. I'm going to direct you to wichitaliberty.org. That's my site. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the other episodes of Wichita Liberty TV and all the other content that I and others produce on almost a daily basis there. So this week we've got Karl Peterjohn back, our co-host, and also Dr. Wolf Van Laer is our guest today. He is Chief Executive Officer at Students for Liberty. He received his PhD in political economy from King's College in London for work focused on entrepreneurship, political economy of crisis, public choice, and Austrian economics. And I know that Dr. Wolf, although still a young man, has traveled all around the world and lived in many places, so certainly appreciate an international perspective. So Wolf Van Laer, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. So Students for Liberty, what's that organization all about?
First and foremost, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Students for Liberty was founded in 2008 in the United States, and the purpose of the organization is to educate and train young individuals on campuses in this country, but all around the world, to spread and defend the ideas of liberty, free markets, free speech, the Constitution. And we are doing that by putting the students in charge. So just in the last 11 months, we had 999 events. Unfortunately, today we didn't break the 1,000 yet, but next week we will, with over 43,000 attendees. And virtually each of these events is conceptualized by and executed by the students. So they're not only spreading the ideas and spreading it to campuses, but they also become leaders. They learn logistical skills, organizational skills, marketing skills, and also public speaking skills. And it's really fantastic because they're spreading the message, and then they become better leaders, and they continue to affect change in that way by starting nonprofits, by becoming journalists, by joining a political party and affecting politics that way. And so that is our hope for the future.
How many of these events were in the United States, and how many were outside, and how many different countries?
So we have a budget of roughly $4 million and a team of 53 full-time members, and most of that is directed at the United States. The results that you're asking about is that we have 565 events in the United States. So a little bit more than half of the events are taking place in this country. But we have events in over 100 countries.
And I think that not always universities, or at least some of the students, are always welcoming. Now, last year here in Wichita, kind of a similar group, I think, Young Americans for Liberty, tried to form a chapter at Wichita State University, and the Student Government Association said no. They didn't think that the free speech stance that Young Americans for Liberty, and I think Students for Liberty has the same view, that that was appropriate, that the woman said that hate speech, although it's deplorable, it still is speech. The answer to that is more speech, not less speech. But the senators at Wichita State University said no. FIRE, an organization, got involved and was able to overturn that. But so has there been resistance to Students for Liberty at American and other college campuses?
Absolutely, and that's unfortunate. First, I would like to say that Young Americans for Liberty is a fantastic group. We're working together with them. Many of their students are also becoming part of our training programs. There are a lot of synergies, and we're working to the same goal, towards freedom and having respectful discourse on campuses. And we have had many experiences like that. Can you believe it? We even had like a case where a student, her name is Nicole Sanders, she handed out the Constitution of the United States of America on campus. And she did do that in a non-free speech zone. And then she got detained by campus police because it was not really sanctions by the bureaucrats.
So if she had done that in a free speech zone, it would have been okay?
Yes, then it would have been okay, and it was just like a very small zone, and we wrote articles about that, showed the ridiculousness of this little zone, and made fun of it, but then also used FIRE, the organization you also mentioned, to sue the school, and subsequently we won, and so it's now a free speech zone completely.
Would you mention which school?
I mean, it has been like a couple of years ago, but it was a school in the Midwest.
Okay.
But yeah, it happens all across the United States, especially at smaller colleges.
Oh, mainly private schools as opposed to public schools?
No, it's mostly public schools, but it happens sometimes at private schools as well. But what is interesting, and we recently had a main event in Washington, D.C., where we had 1,300 people. Steve Forbes was there, the CEO.
Is that LibertyCon?
Correct,
Yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you for mentioning it. John Mackey, our board member and CEO of Whole Foods, was there. People from the liberty movement in this country and around the whole world were there. And I made a point in my presentation there that free speech is important and we need to defend it every single day. But I think the liberty movement, or people who are conservative or classical liberal libertarian, often we don't do a good job. Because we always say like, oh, we are so smart and we have read the constitutions and the Federalist Papers and all of these sorts of things. But very few people have read the thinkers on the left that lead to these anti-free speech sentiments.
Well, I want to talk about some of those people in the next segment, but before we finish up this segment, so the in America, I guess you can get in trouble with your university if you distribute the Constitution, but in other countries, the penalties can be quite more severe.
Yes, absolutely, and that's also the power of our organization, to show students in the United States how important it is to fight for liberty. Because the United States is a relatively free country, and while the free speech issues is serious and we need to address it, I mean, yes, there's like trigger warnings, but if you look at a country like Venezuela, where you can speak up and you're being thrown in prison, if you talk to people like that, that gives you a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
Jorge Brasati is one of our leaders. He's now based in Florida. Jorge is a youth political leader. He is 21 years old. He has 100,000 followers on Twitter. He speaks out for free markets. He advocates for thinkers like Hayek and Mises. And he cannot go back to his country.
He's Venezuelan?
He's Venezuelan. He cannot go back to his country because he knows that he would be detained immediately. Some of his friends who are there for the protest, and they protest every single day against the regime, they have been thrown in jail. And if you talk to someone like that on his experiences, it gets a completely different quality to you, like why you should fight for the ideas of liberty. One day I was working with him and we had a training with Jorge and the 100 best leaders in the United States. And a video came out about Leopoldo Lopez, who is a conservative, classical liberal leader in Venezuela, opposition leader. He was at that time in prison. There was a video coming out, and I speak a little bit of Spanish. He was yelling to his wife from the prison cell that he's being tortured. And I saw that, and I was going immediately to Jorge, because I know that some of his friends are being in prison as well. So if you look him in the eye and see the pain about that his friends are likely to be tortured as well because of the ideas that they stand for, which just leads to human liberty and dignity, then you understand why we are standing up for these principles and for the Constitution, and that really changes you.
That's really unfortunate to hear those stories. So let's take our first commercial break for today. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn and our guest, Dr. Wolf von Laer of Students for Liberty. So last fall we had Matt Kibbe, I think another leader of the freedom movement in Wichita, spoke about young people and socialism, and I think he's convinced that young people, college people I think he was talking about, they really seem attracted to socialism. He thinks it's partly because they just don't really understand what people of Karl's and my age may have seen firsthand, at least in the news and anything. So do you find that to be the case as well, that people don't really know what socialism truly means?
Absolutely, and then you add the also positively connoted term democratic socialism, whatever that means, to it, and then people get confused. And I mean, your generation, you understand, like, you remember the Cold War. I grew up, and one of my earliest memories was that we drove to East Germany and we crossed the border and the wall. Like, I've seen that. My country has been divided by both sides. National Socialism, which is the same thing, and socialism, or communism, if you want to use that term. And I understand that. I've seen that. And I work with students whose parents have been put in a gulag in Estonia. And they have a motivation to fight for these ideas because they've seen that it affected their families, and many family members have been killed by this very, very despicable ideology. However, the ideology comes in the disguise of positive values like equality and fairness and making capitalism work for everyone, or the economic system working for everyone.
Yeah.
And so they are appealed to, it's appealing to them for those sorts of reasons.
And young people tell me, you know, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, those people were anomalies. They were evil people, and they used socialism the wrong way. But you know what? This Bernie Sanders guy, he knows how to make socialism work.
Yeah, he's an elderly guy who can really invoke positive feelings about that, and he talks about these values. He never talks about the atrocities that happened during the regime in Cuba or Venezuela, or he tries to relativize this and say, oh, this is just because the political manifestation doesn't look like it. But if we try this here in America, it would work.
Yeah.
But we do know from history that it never works. And there's empirical evidence so much about that the more you have free markets and the rule of law, the better people will flourish and the more equality we'll have at the end.
And don't we get people today, Karl, telling us that, well, Venezuela, that's not socialism. That problems there are because of the low price of oil. Don't they say stuff like that?
Well, you have an infinite number of excuses why socialism has never worked correctly. The question I'd like to put to you, Wolf, is tied to, some people say it's because the students are being indoctrinated, that equality, social justice, all the euphemisms are being constructed. But others would say we haven't looked at the history of socialism and its record of failure. It's failed everywhere it's been tried. Which do you think is the bigger problem, the lack of a historical appreciation of the failures of socialism, or the practical, don't you want to be for equality and for fairness?
Social justice, that sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, and who can disagree with that, right? So I think these problems go hand in hand, how you describe them. So the main reason, there's many different reasons for that, but think about who is teaching at universities. Those are people who went normally to public school, then they joined a public university, then they joined another public university where they're teaching now. They have never been outside of the public school system. Sure, there are exceptions, and not everyone is like that, but they have never seen what it means to work in a free market and to try to make a living. You guys have to do that, right? You know how difficult that is, and that you have to compete with other television stations. And if you have these experiences, you understand that this is a good thing, and that leads to better results. But if you've never made that experience, you can talk from your ivory tower and never look at any other evidence that might undermine your worldview.
Well, is there an appreciation that socialism is basically another word for a monopoly of power by the collective? However that collective is defined, it could be a judicial oligarchy where the judicial edicts come down from on high. It could become the maximum ruler in the People's Republic, however that person's defined. It can be some sort of a junta of some sort, central committee. But the distinction is largely without a real practical difference when everything's top down, very little is bottom up.
Yes, and it comes very intuitively to us as human beings because we have been for millennia in tribal systems. And a bottom-down system where you have one leader or a group of leaders in charge, it works very well for 50 or 60 or 70 people. But if you talk about a society in the United States of 320 million people, or 84 million people in Germany, you need different systems. You need bottom-up structures. You need markets where you have trial and error and people competing to find solutions to problems. And what I really admire about the United States is your strong civil society. The US was founded on the belief that you don't need to go to government for every single problem. You can solve it with your church or with homeless shelters that you voluntarily found. And that's why you're so robust. But nowadays, people always look, there's a problem, you have to go to the government. And that's the issue.
Let's take another commercial break for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peter John. Dr. Wolf von Laer of Students for Liberty is our guest today. Talking about socialism and young people, I can't remember who said this, but it might have been Jeffrey Tucker or somebody. He says, ask young people this: do you want the government running Amazon and Uber? And then they maybe start to understand a little bit like that. But, I think another problem we have is that young people, college-age people, as they've been growing up, they grew up during the Great Recession, which we're I guess, coming out of. And you wrote an article I found in 2013, How Lehman Brothers Crash 5 Years Ago Made Me Appreciate Markets. Now, I think the young people are told that it was massive deregulation of Wall Street by George Bush and maybe even Bill Clinton before that, but they caused the Wall Street crash and all the misery we're having.
Absolutely, and I was studying in Germany back then, and I couldn't really understand it. And the narrative of the media, probably not this particular station, but of the media and politicians was, oh, it's the greed of the bankers, or it's capitalism's fault. And these explanations were not really convincing. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I started to Google and looked for alternative explanations. And I found out about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but also about the Community Reinvestment Act of 1979, but eventually also about the role of monetary theory and easy money in fueling booms and bust cycles. And then I've started learning about thinkers like Hayek and Mises, and I would encourage the audience to look them up, and their explanation why crises happen. And I found that a much more convincing explanation. And so subsequently I wrote about that in German, and I became like much more classical liberal, or libertarian as you would say. Mm-hmm. And crisis can be opportunity for changing one's minds, but I mean, if the narrative generally from the parents and from the schools is that it's the failure of capitalism, mm-hmm. Who's defending that? Yeah, well, it's everybody that says that. Well, almost everybody, not our friends, but but I mean that's it. Yeah, they think that the government caused it, and so what do we do?
No, well, it's not the government. Although I would say it was the government, mm-hmm. but they're saying it's the private sector with the evil bankers at the apex of the blame list, unless they're with the politically correct banks that are closely tied with the government.
Oh yeah. Doing my research for my PhD, where I studied lawmaking during crisis and after recessions, I found a letter by John Allison, the former CEO mm-hmm. of BB&T, mm-hmm. and he said, look, we don't need your money, talking about the American Recovery Reinvestment Act, where they put a lot of capital into banks and forced them to take money, and said, like, I don't want this money. We are sound. We didn't engage in these toxic assets. We were not part of that. Let them go under. But unfortunately, nobody listened to John. I think didn't the Federal Reserve actually force him his bank to take some funds? Yeah. Yes. And we know him. I mean, he ended up serving at Cato for a little bit and was considered as Treasury Secretary maybe for a moment and in the Trump administration. But that would have been good if that had happened, I think.
Well, let me ask a question, because you mentioned the Federal Reserve. I view it as the original public-private partnership. Does your organization have a perspective on these kind of hybrid institutions that have public aspects on one side, and you mentioned Freddie and Fannie, mm-hmm. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, that were deeply involved in the housing crisis? I think they're kind of offshoots. They're more recent than the Federal Reserve, which goes back a little over a century. And when we look at public-private partnerships, is there a problem in terms of accountability and responsibility, and that they're really government-driven and not market-driven when you get to the bottom line? Absolutely. I mean, from an economist's point of view, you would say you would never want to regulate the price of milk. We economists understand very well why price controls will lead to fewer goods available, and you really undermine your goal of having more milk available. Every economist agrees with that. However, if you talk about money as a good, because it's just for the exchange of different goods, suddenly everything changes. Suddenly most economists, besides like the Austrian School of Economics, and Mises and Hayek are representatives of that, they say, oh no, you have to control money. You have to have the government in charge of that. And it's a public-private relationship, but at the end of the day, the government decides who is on the board of the Federal Reserve, and they're then making the decision how to set the interest rate, which is the price of savings. Because if you have a market and you have more savings, interest rates will go down. The price of savings, then you can just, like, capital will go down. If you have fewer people, more people consuming and less savings, then interest rates go up. But they just artificially set that price. And so market mechanisms cannot work, and that leads to distortions, and I would argue for crisis. Very interesting. Well, let's take our last commercial break for the day. We'll be back in just a moment.
Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, our co-host Karl Peter John. Our guest today, Dr. Wolf von Laer of Students for Liberty. So, Wolf, you're in Wichita today to speak to the Wichita Pachyderm Club, and I believe the topic of your speech is the case for optimism, how young people change the world. So, what's going to be the focus of your speech today?
Yes, and your audience might be skeptical because we talked about the university campuses and what's going on there, and the media loves that and say like, oh, everyone is going crazy and so forth. And yes, there is truth to that, and we need to tackle that. But it ignores the fact that there are now thousands of students out there who endorse these liberty principles and who stand up for that in an effective way. And I'm very optimistic because the organization is changing lives. I used to be a volunteer for Students for Liberty myself in Europe. And that was in 2011, and there was nothing going on there in terms of student movement for liberty. And we were just 7 people. We had no idea what we were doing. And now we have hundreds of people in different countries. We changing policies in some countries. The students go on, like not we personally because we are 501c3, but the students go on and affect change in that way because they become better leaders, and then they start nonprofits and think tanks and so forth. To just give you an idea, we are only around for 10 years now. But our folks have started 30 nonprofits, and I think you recently had Tom Palmer on. Mm-hmm. He's representative of the Atlas Network, who trains, like the organization that trains think tanks. And 10 of our people now are like part of their programs.
Of the Atlas, okay.
And many politicians, and they continue to hold on to the banner of liberty and spread it across the world. And I think we see a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, and it's growing. Mm-hmm. So that makes me optimistic.
And so, in your experience, are American college students much different from those in Europe or Asia or other countries you're familiar with?
There are differences for sure. So the main difference is that there is more of a hunger for liberty in countries that have been more deprived of it, or they have a history of socialism. So we are very strong in the Balkans, for instance. We have 50 people in Venezuela, even though they're really risking their lives advocating for these ideas in that country. Mm-hmm. Because they know that their life and their family's lives is at stake. So there's a different motivation of it. And in Western countries, in Germany, in America, people are fairly free, and they have less of an incentive to stand up for it.
Are the countries used to be behind the Iron Curtain, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, just to name the Czech Republic, more receptive at the university level because of their history of having to deal with, I'd view it as collectivism broadly defined without going down the rat's nest of National Socialism, Nazism, fascism, international socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, we do see that. To give you like an example from Georgia, the country, the biggest event that our students have organized was over 900 people. And we paid for this $1,500 because they raised all the money themselves. And this is like a team of 10 or 11 people. They have professional television teams there. They go to all of the universities and they talk about that. And there's like much more of an appreciation for that. So yes, we see that. So Poland is strong, Serbia is strong, Czech Republic is strong. You can go every week in the Czech Republic in Prague into a pub. You can have a beer and you can talk about liberty every single week. And there will be 50 to 100 people. And Matt Kibbe has been speaking there actually. Mm-hmm.
So is it partly because like these young people, I mean, their parents grew up probably under a more totalitarian type of state than they have now. Is that part of the difference, do you think?
That is part of the difference. They hear the stories, what happened to them, that they couldn't speak freely, that they couldn't choose their work, that they were deprived of many economic means and like consumption, but also you see it everywhere. Capital depreciation. You see like old rundown buildings, and then they go to the United States or go to like other countries which are more capitalistic. And they see the contrast and then they ask themselves, like, why is that? Mm-hmm. And so there is a little bit more of a rift there. But since many Western countries in the United States, we have lived in like fairly prosperous times for many, many decades now, it is less apparent that we need to continue to have freedom preserved in order to flourish as a species.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like we may be becoming complacent. Is that perhaps?
I would say so. And I would also say that from a parenting level, like if I ask you now, like when was your first job? How old were you?
Oh, 15 or...
15. Yours?
14.
14. And I could ask like the audience that, and the answer would be different according to the generations. Mine was 14 as well. I was a paperboy for 4 years. Mm-hmm. But if you ask many kids nowadays, they cannot work, maybe because of minimum wage laws, or maybe their parents don't want them to work and they just
Yeah.
want to go to soccer practice or whatever it is. And if you don't have liberty and responsibility, then you are more likely, I'm not saying everyone, I'm just painting a rough picture here, it's more likely that people become like less responsible and always ask for the government to fix something instead of looking at themselves and their community and their family.
Well, that's very interesting, and we are out of time for today. So Dr. Wolf von Laer of Students for Liberty, thank you so much for your time. Karl, Peter, John, thank you. And thanks to you, the viewer. We'll be back again next week.